She did not flinch. That was the thing people never understood when she told the story years later. If she ever told it at all. They expected tears, or a sharp word thrown back across the table. They expected something that matched the size of what had been said. But Mirabelle Ashby simply folded her napkin, set it beside her plate with a precision that could only have come from years of practice, and looked at the candle flame rather than at her husband. It was November. The dining room at Holt House smelled of beeswax and coal smoke and the faint sweetness of the apple preserves that had been opened that afternoon. Outside, rain came down in long, quiet sheets against the windows. 3 people sat at the table: Mirabelle, her husband Crispin, and his mother, Mrs. Alderton, who held her wine glass by the stem and watched everything with the patient attention of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. What Crispin said was not complicated. It rarely was with him. He had looked at Mirabelle across the centerpiece, a cluster of dried hydrangeas gone the color of ash, and said that he could not imagine any man of standing choosing her willingly, that the arrangement between their families had been a matter of land and debt and nothing more, that she ought to know her place clearly, so there would be no confusion between them going forward. He said it the way a man might read a column of figures, evenly, without malice and without warmth, which was, Mirabelle had come to understand over 2 years of marriage, the most exhausting kind of cruelty there was. Mrs. Alderton made a small sound of agreement and reached for the bread. Mirabelle looked at the candle flame a moment longer. Then she pushed back her chair, stood and said, "Excuse me," as though she were stepping out to see about the weather. She did not run. She walked up the staircase at the same pace she always did, one hand trailing the banister. She went to the bedroom she and Crispin shared, but had never inhabited together in any meaningful sense, and she opened the wardrobe, and she began to choose. There was a trunk at the back of the room. It had belonged to her mother, and before that to her grandmother, and it was covered in a paper that had once been blue, and was now closer to gray. Mirabelle had been looking at it since the day she arrived at Holt House, the way a person looks at a door they are not yet ready to open. She opened it that night. She packed slowly and with great care, the way she had been taught to do everything. 2 wool dresses, the gray one and the dark green, her good boots, her sewing case, which was small but held everything she needed, a book she had been reading and had not yet finished, 3 letters from her sister in Philadelphia, her mother's cameo brooch, which she had worn exactly once since coming to this house, because Mrs. Alderton had looked at it in a way that made Mirabelle want to put it away somewhere safe. She packed it now. The house went quiet below her. She heard the drawing-room door close, and then the soft, regular sound of Mrs. Alderton's footsteps on the floor overhead, retiring to her own room. She heard Crispin's chair scrape. Then nothing for a long time. She was not afraid of him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was not running from violence or from cruelty of the kind that left marks. She was running from something slower and in some ways worse. The steady, daily work of being made to feel like a problem that had been poorly solved. 2 years of that was enough. She closed the trunk, fastened the latches, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening to the rain. Then she stood, put on her coat and her hat, picked up the trunk by its handles. It was heavy, but she was stronger than people assumed, and carried it to the top of the stairs. Crispin was in the hallway below, holding a lamp. He looked up at her. He looked at the trunk. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise, and not quite recognition. Whatever it was, it came too late. "You cannot go anywhere at this hour," he said. "I can," Mirabelle said. Mirabelle, but she was already on the stairs, and she had the kind of face in that moment that ends conversations. She passed him in the hall without looking at him, opened the front door, and walked out into the November rain. She had one plan, and it was this. The village of Greer's Crossing, 14 miles east, where a woman named Mrs. Fawcett kept a boarding house and was known to take in respectable women in difficult circumstances. Mirabelle had heard of her from her cousin, who had heard of her from someone else, and it was the kind of information that women passed between themselves in low voices and then filed away in case it was ever needed. Mirabelle had filed it away 2 years ago, when she first arrived at Holt House and understood the shape of what her life was going to be. She walked 3 miles in the dark before a farm cart, heading east, stopped and offered her a ride. The driver was an elderly man with a dog asleep across his feet and the good manners not to ask questions. He dropped her at the edge of Greer's Crossing just before 4 in the morning, tipped his hat, and continued on his way. The boarding house was easy to find. There was a lamp in the window. Mrs. Fawcett, it turned out, kept one burning all night, a habit she had developed years ago and never explained. Mirabelle knocked. The door opened within a minute, which also went unexplained. Mrs. Fawcett was a small woman with white hair and the hands of someone who had worked hard all her life and was proud of it. She looked at Mirabel standing on her step with a trunk and rein on her coat and no letter of introduction, and said, "You look like you could use some tea." "I could," Mirabel said. "Come in then." The room was small and faced east, which meant the morning light came in early and strong. Mirabel found she did not mind this. She had lived the last 2 years in a house where the best rooms all faced west, and the mornings were gray and slow, and she had come to believe, without quite knowing it, that this was simply what mornings were. She found work within a week. There was a family in Greer's Crossing named Hollowell, a widower named Mr. Hollowell, and his 3 children, and a household that had been managing without proper organization since the death of Mrs. Hollowell 18 months earlier. The house was not dirty, but it was untended in the way that houses become when no one is holding the center. Things were set down and not put back. Meals arrived at irregular times. The children were underfoot and anxious in the particular way that children become when the adults around them are overwhelmed. Mirabel was hired to manage the household, not as a housekeeper, though she would have accepted that. Mr. Hollowell, to his credit, understood the difference and made it plain from the beginning. She had her own room, her meals at the table with the family, and a small wage that was enough. She was good at it. She had always been good at the work that running a household required: the accounting, the ordering, the management of people and provisions and time. At Holt House, this ability had been used and unacknowledged, which is a particular kind of invisible labor that leaves no mark except in the person doing it. Here, it was simply work. It was needed, it was done, it was appreciated in the direct, practical way that people appreciate something when they have been without it. The children warmed to her gradually, the way children do when they've been hurt before. Testing first, pulling back, watching. The eldest, a girl of 10 named Susanna, appointed herself Mirabel's shadow for the first 2 weeks, following her from room to room with the silent assessment of someone conducting a thorough audit. By the 3rd week, she was helping with the linen inventory and had opinions about it. Mirabel let her have them. The letter came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she had left Holt House. She recognized the handwriting immediately, though she had rarely seen it. Crispin wrote as little as possible, in all areas of life. The envelope had been sent to her mother's house in the county first, and then forwarded here, which told her that Crispin had been in contact with her family. She did not know yet what had been said. She opened it standing in the kitchen, because that was where she was when it arrived, and she did not see the need to find a more appropriate room. It was not an apology. She had not expected one. It was a request written in the level, practical tone Crispin used for all correspondence, informing her that there was a matter concerning the Ashby property records that required her attention. Her father's land, which had come to Crispin through their marriage agreement, was now at the center of a boundary dispute with the neighboring estate, and the solicitor handling the matter had requested that she return to clarify certain documents that bore her original signature. At the bottom, in smaller letters, "I am not writing to ask you to come back. I am writing because I am required to inform you. What you do is your business." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and went back to making the bread she'd been making before it arrived. She thought about it for 3 days. It was not the land she cared about, not exactly. But it had been her father's, and her father had worked 40 years of his life to hold it, and she had grown up with the knowledge that it would one day pass to her, and that this was a kind of safety, the kind that came from the ground itself, and could not be taken by fashion or opinion, or the cruelty of other people's opinions. And then it had been taken, technically, by marriage, and used to settle a debt that was not hers. And she had understood this was how things worked, but had never quite stopped feeling the loss of it. She thought, if there was something to be said about those documents, she was the one to say it. She thought she was not going back to Holt House, but she could go to the solicitor's office. She arranged 2 days away from the Hollowell household. Hollowell was understanding about it in the quiet way he was understanding about most things, and she took the coach east on a Thursday morning, with the letter in her bag, and her coat buttoned to the throat against the November cold. The solicitor's name was Mr. Graves, and he had an office above a printer's shop in the county seat, up a narrow staircase that smelled of ink and paper, and something dusty that Mirabel couldn't place. He was a thin man in his 60s with the careful eyes of someone who read documents for a living, and had learned to look for what wasn't there as much as what was. He seemed surprised to see her. "Mrs. Ashby," he said, rising from his desk. "Miss Vane," she said, which was her own name and the one she intended to use going forward. My correspondence may still carry the other name. I apologize for the confusion. Mr. Graves looked at her for a moment, then nodded and wrote something on a small slip of paper on his desk. Miss Vane, he said, as though filing it away. Thank you for coming. The dispute, as he explained it, came down to a surveying error from 30 years ago that had embedded itself in 3 separate sets of property records, and then been ignored until now, when the neighboring landowner, a man named Baxter, who had purchased the adjoining estate the previous year, had finally read his deeds carefully and noticed the discrepancy. The boundary line as described in the oldest documents did not match the boundary line as described in the more recent ones, and the difference amounted to a strip of land 40 feet wide and a quarter-mile long, which was not enormous but was not nothing either, and included the access road to the eastern field. The documents Mirabel had signed at the time of her marriage were the most recent in the chain. If they could be shown to have been signed in error, if the original description had been carried forward incorrectly from the earlier deeds, then the line could be redrawn in accordance with the original survey. Mirabel sat across from Mr. Graves in the hard chair that visitors were apparently expected to use, and looked at the documents he spread across the desk. She had a good memory for numbers and for the particular language of property records, because her father had believed that a woman who could not read her own deeds was a woman who could be swindled, and he had spent considerable time over the years making sure she was not that woman. She found the error in 11 minutes. It was not in the documents she had signed. It was in the deed of transfer executed by Crispin's father 17 years earlier, when he had consolidated 2 parcels that should have been described separately. Someone had copied the metes and bounds for one parcel twice and omitted the second entirely, and every document after that had simply carried the mistake forward, because no one had gone back to check. She explained this to Mr. Graves clearly and in order. He listened. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. Then he said, Miss Vane, you may have just saved this estate a considerable amount of litigation. I may have, she said. I will need a written acknowledgement of the original error and its source. He wrote it. She stood, put on her gloves, and thanked him for his time. The hallway outside the solicitor's office was narrow, and Crispin was standing in it. She had not known he would be there. Whether he had known she would be, she couldn't say. His face, as always, gave her nothing to read. He was standing with his hat in his hands, and his coat slightly wet from the cold outside, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen him use before, which was the expression of a man who is not certain what he is going to say. Mirabel, he said. Mr. Ashby, she said, because she was no longer his wife in any practical sense and she had earned the right to make that plain. The solicitor tells me, then you know, she said. She moved a step past him. He didn't block her exactly, but he shifted in a way that required her to stop or to push past, and she stopped. I'm told you found the source of the discrepancy, he said. I did, in 11 minutes, yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through whatever it was he was working through. And she felt something very clearly. She was not angry at him. She had been angry for a long time, months, possibly the whole 2 years of the marriage, and at some point in the last 3 weeks, the anger had simply finished the way a fire finishes when there is nothing left to burn. What she felt now was something cooler and more settled. She felt like herself, which she had not felt in a long time. You solved it faster than the 3 solicitors I have paid this year, he said. I know, she said. My mother, he started, and then stopped. Mirabel waited. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was one of the things people said about her as though it were a compliment, and she had decided in the last 3 weeks that patience was in fact a compliment if you chose it, and something else entirely if it was simply the thing you did because you didn't believe you had any other option. She had chosen to wait. My mother said certain things, Crispin said finally, that I should have, that I allowed. He stopped again. You don't need to say it the way you think it should be said, Mirabel told him. Just say the true part. He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. She has run this household since I was 11 years old, he said. I know that is not an excuse. I know it explains what happened in a way that doesn't change the fact of what happened. No. Mirabel agreed. It doesn't. I thought you were a poor match, he said. I was told you were a poor match, and I believed it because I had been told what to believe about most things since I was very young. I was told what to think about the land and the marriage and about you specifically, and I did not examine any of it. He said this looking at her directly, which was more honesty than she had seen from him in 2 years, and she gave him credit for it. And now, she said, and now I am trying to examine it, he said. I am not certain I know how. Outside, the wind moved against the windows of the stairwell, and somewhere below them the printer's press started up again with its rhythmic, heavy beat. "Then you will have to learn," Mirabel said. "That is not my task." She moved past him and went down the stairs, and she did not look back, and she did not cry, and she held the solicitor's written acknowledgment in her bag, and thought about the eastern field with its proper access road, and the 40 feet of ground that was, after all, correctly described in the oldest documents, the ones no one had bothered to read. She was back at the Hollowell house by Friday evening. Susanna met her at the door and reported, in considerable detail, everything that had happened in her absence. A broken window latch in the upstairs hall, a dispute between the cook and the delivery boy from the butcher, and a discovery of what appeared to be a robin's nest in the old garden shed, which Susanna considered extremely important and wished to show Mirabel at the earliest possible opportunity. "Tomorrow morning," Mirabel said, taking off her coat, "before the accounting." "Before the accounting," Susanna agreed, as though this were a negotiated agreement between equals. Mirabel hung her coat and went to warm herself by the kitchen fire, and she thought about the cold stairwell and the man standing in it with his hat in his hands, and she thought about her father's land, and she thought about the word that Mr. Graves had used, saved. He had said, "You may have saved," and she sat with that word for a while, not performing anything with it, just letting it exist. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived from Crispin. It was longer than the first and more carefully written. It said that his mother had agreed to take up permanent residence at her sister's home, Charlottesville, which had been the arrangement offered and accepted on both sides. It said that the property records had been corrected and registered with the county, and that a copy had been sent to her. It said that if she wished to discuss any further matter, he was available to discuss it, on her terms and in her time. He did not ask her to come back. He said only that the house felt very quiet and he was learning to cook his own eggs, which he was not especially good at, and he had read, recently, the deed of transfer from his father's estate. And then he had read the one before that, and then the one before that, and he now understood what she had found in 11 minutes, and what it had cost him not to look before. He had not understood, he said, what he had in her. Mirabel read the letter at the kitchen table after the children had been put to bed. She read it once, and then she folded it and held it for a moment, and then she got up and put the kettle on and stood at the window, watching the winter dark outside while the water heated. She did not decide anything that night. She allowed herself not to. That, too, was something she had learned in the last 3 weeks. That a decision made without hurry was a decision made by someone who knew she had options. And she did have options. She had found them in herself, in a small room facing east, in the ordered satisfaction of a household that ran well because she made it run well, in the face of a 10-year-old girl who followed her around and asked questions and had opinions about linen inventory, and trusted, without being told she could, that her trust was safe. She made the tea. She drank it standing up. She put the cup down carefully on the counter, and she did not make any promises to anyone, including herself, and she looked out at the dark field behind the Hollowell house, and she thought, "I know what I am worth now." That was enough. For tonight, that was enough.